Hello, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira from the Groundwater Project, and I'm here to introduce you a very nice book, nice reading, and you will be like me, willing to visit the place after you see the explanations and the nice pictures. It's well done, and we have here today the two authors of this nice book about the Edwards Aquifer in the US. Is Jack Sharp. He is the Carlton Professor of Geology Emeritus at the University of Texas. He has a Bachelor of Science in Geology from the University of Minnesota, a Master of Science degree, and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Illinois. He has supervised over 50 undergraduate and precisely 100 graduate students. Wow, that's an achievement. Congrats. And we have here also Ron Green. Ron completed his studies in hydrology at the University of Arizona and a brief stint in environmental consulting. He spent his career at Southwest Research Institute working in applied research. He worked on assessment of water resources targeting karst terrains in arid and semi-arid environments. He recently co-edited a memoir titled The Edwards Aquifer, The Past, Present, and Future of a Vital Water Resource, in which he authored several chapters. Thank you very much. Thank you and congratulations for a book well done. That was very nice. Thank you for offering us that. Please introduce yourselves a little bit as persons, not only as researchers, and extend a little bit the CVs I just read. That's too dry to start. Thank you very much, guys. Welcome.
Well, I guess, yeah, I'm Jack Sharp, and I was born and raised in a small town in Minnesota, far from Texas. And I always loved water. I always loved water. And when I got out of the Air Force, I was a civil engineer in the Air Force. I decided I really wanted to study science, and I went to the University of Illinois, studied with Pat Domenico, and it was a wonderful choice. And hydrogeology is a great field. I've learned so much. It's been very rewarding. You get the chance, because no matter where you are on the Earth's surface, there's a problem with groundwater that needs study.
Definitely. That's well put.
And when I moved to Texas, the Edwards Aquifer is right under the feet. It's economically important. It's culturally important. It's important for environmentally, and it's just a natural. And it's I have learned so much and continue to learn, and with great colleagues like Ron and Gary Schindel, who also edited the book. It's been a wonderful adventure. We're still learning.
Thank you, Ron.
Yes, thanks. So I'm from the Midwest of the U.S. also. I'm from Michigan, and came to the field just a little bit later than Jack. I got out of school in industrial engineering, but then went in the Peace Corps and got introduced to water and came back and sort of went back to school, eventually got my PhD at Arizona and worked up in the Midwest for a little while longer, but came down to Texas in the late 80s and was introduced to the Edwards and the karst. And it was a real eye-opening experience. And it was quite interesting because after 4 years at Arizona, the term karst was not used once. It was just not appreciated. So you had, hydrologists with classical training in hydrology interacting with cavers down here who saw the wonders of a karst system and the Edwards, which is just prolific, as Jack was just talking about. So starting in the 90s, I was, spent a considerable part of my career, working on the Edwards, learning about karst in general and working in other areas with karst. And, have teamed up with Jack over the past number of years on studies. And he was a co-editor of the book on the Edwards that we had before. So this has been a very nice opportunity, as you mentioned, Everton, to bring things together in a single document so that, you don't have to look at the different pieces.
That's very good. That's very good. So for the general public that we're trying to reach, we're trying to bring in more interested people. What is the importance of the Edwards Aquifer and what people can learn from the experience you have there?
Well, geez, it starts way back that San Antonio, Austin, San Marcos, New Braunfels, many of the towns were established right where the major springs were that discharged from the Edwards Aquifer. So it really goes back to the founding of the civilization or European civilization here in this area. And that's where the cities were. And it was such a wonderful resource that I think people thought it was infinite. You could put a well down, pump as much as you wanted everywhere. And we do have the biggest well in the world.
Oh, really?
The Catfish Farm well, which is the biggest free flowing well in the world. So, of course, Texas, it has to be the biggest and best.
That's right, exactly.
And then when I came down to Texas, I'd been at Missouri in the 80s, and we really thought back in the 80s and 90s, we really understood the aquifer. But as we keep getting new data, we say, oh my gosh, there's things we had never imagined. And so this has been an evolutionary process, at least for me, and I think for Ron and people that like this system. And we hope it might serve as a template or a guide for people looking at karst aquifers elsewhere in the world.
Very good. Ron.
Well, I agree with Jack. It's it serves as a resource now for about 2 million people, and Jack and I have built on work done by some of the giants in the past. Bob McClay, in particular, had just a seminal work in the 90s that we've built on, and we use that as the foundation for what we've done. Bob just had a great insight and did some of the very best early work on this stuff. But as we've gone along, we've learned an awful lot more about the system in general and in particular. So as the karst science has evolved, we understand better about the importance of karst flow and the evolution of a karst system. But we've also learned an awful lot about the Edwards, about where the water comes from, how it gets to the springs, the mechanisms of recharge. It's just a very complicated system, and it's taken a good chunk of the last 2 or 3 decades to move this understanding along. And so Jack said back in the the 80s and 90s, we kind of thought we knew what we're talking about, where we didn't. And now we're up 20, 30 years later, and we've learned an awful lot. But I think a lot needs to be understood and studied as we go on. And I think it's fine tuning what's been done. And hopefully this document, this manuscript will serve as an opportunity for others to take a look at where we are today and help identify what can continue to be done to understand things. And it's going to be very important because the threats and the demands on this resource are only going to get bigger as we go along. This is an area with tremendous growth in population, and that's putting stresses on the system. And we're just going to have to understand the system better in order to meet those challenges.
Right, and we've got the population is expected to double in a couple of decades, and we've got the effects of climate change that is going to cause uncertainties. And as we develop, there's going to be new chemicals in the system that we use that is always going to be a threat. So it's going to be a challenge, but I'm hopeful we can meet it. And if you have knowledge of the system, it's easier to meet those challenges than if you don't have that knowledge. So the research is not done by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, exactly. And the population in Texas is increasing quickly. Lots of people from all over the country, it's moving to Texas now. It's impressive. Yeah, you agree?
Yeah, we say there's only 2 types of people in the world. Some were born in Texas. The rest wish they had been born in Texas, and they're moving to Texas.
Well, you see, it does sound like a Texan now. It does sound, that's very good. Okay. So Your book has very beautiful pictures, enough to make us willing to visit the springs that you presented. Are all of them in discharge areas as well as, the aquifer in general, well preserved? Do these springs, these nice springs that you showed, make groundwater visible to people living on top of the aquifer? This is a tricky question because this is the year where we're trying to make the invisible visible, as the UNESCO called. That's why I embedded the question for you guys.
Well, the pictures we showed were all springs that there is public access to, but there are others, Ron, I think that are in private land that we still need to look at.
Yeah, there's been some legal actions taken to protect those larger springs, mostly because of the endangered species. So the federal government stepped in and requested the state and some more, stressful terms that they had to protect those environments for those species. So they've gone, and the state has gone and put in some protections for the springs, mostly in cutting back pumping during periods of drought. And they use trigger wells for that, and they use spring discharge, and that's for the larger springs. But unfortunately, throughout Texas, they've lost over the past, 50 to 100 years, several hundred named springs due to overpumping. And that's something that the folks that rely on the Edwards don't want to see. So it's not just the aquifer and how much water's there for pumping, but it's these very dependent environments at these major springs that are being protected. So, the state has, stepped up to do that, and they've managed to protect these springs over the last decade or so. What remains to be seen is what happens when we repeat a drought of record that was experienced back in the 50s, when precipitation is low for a number of years and recharge, as a consequence, is low. What will happen then when they have to start restricting pumping to degrees that may be a real challenge to the communities? We're going to have to see how that plays out. And hopefully these restrictions and these regulations that are put in place will help us get through that. But, that's something that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I agree with you.
In addition, the Edwards Aquifer Authority has established basically refugia. They've established 2 places where they're breeding the endangered species. So if the springs dry up and the species disappear, once the springs flow again, they can reintroduce them. And it's interesting, the sustainability of the aquifer, because when we get these huge rainfalls, and you get huge rainfalls in Texas, and the aquifer can, in essence, fill up in a period of a few weeks or months sometimes. So in the long run, it's sustainable, but in the short run, under drought conditions, it is not. So it's interesting, in the long run, it's probably sustainable, but in the short run, it may not be.
Interesting. Well, it's going to be tricky if you double the population, as you mentioned, to manage the aquifer. You don't need a lot of brain power to work together, because it's such a huge aquifer, isn't it?
Yes, and there's a number of things that is being done. There's a conjunctive use with surface water. There's aquifer storage and recovery, and we may even be seeing desalination of the brackish water portions of the aquifer. So those are things that are being looked at very seriously now.
Okay, so I have a more geological question. We have lots of studies in the aquifer, which is very nice to see put together in your book. How was the aquifer formed? And what do you know about the groundwater that flow in it?
Well, they're Cretaceous beds. So they were formed, somewhat over 100 million years ago. Jack can be more precise in that as a professor, but it's a large plateau in central Texas, and it's gone to uplifts over geologic time, and that's exposed those carbonate beds to the atmosphere. So, you know, there's different parts of the aquifer as we try to describe in the book. And you have this faulting that's along the south and the east of this plateau called the Balcones Fault Zone that has led to the somewhat complex structural geology where you have these older beds at a higher elevation than the younger beds that are in the recharge zone and the confined zone. So that has what's produced the real significant part of the aquifer. So, you know, this has happened over time. So the karst development up on the plateau tends to be a little bit different than in the confined zone. It's just where the preferential flow paths have gone, but they are extensive. There's been some significant dye tracing that shows that, you know, the karst flow, similar to elsewhere in the world, is, you know, 1 to 2 kilometers a day, sometimes more. It's very fast. The aquifer has shown great resilience. It can go from record lows to record highs in as little as a year to 18 months. And the reverse can happen if it goes into a drought. So the aquifer is, you know, shown itself to be, you know, very sensitive to the climate. It's also shown itself to be very sensitive to land use. And we've seen, unfortunately, too many instances where land use over the aquifer has not been controlled as well as it should. So there are activities in the recharge zone in particular that lead to degradation of the aquifer, particularly down in the confined zone. But what is just being better understood and appreciated is the importance of the contributing zone. And the past thoughts of how that operated was like a tin roof. That precipitation would fall on the contributing zone, it would flow across the surface over the recharge zone and get to the subsurface. Well, what we've learned is that it's more like a leaky tin roof, and those carbonates that form the contributing zone, which is the lower units in many cases, are not that dissimilar to the Edwards. So you get these lower units, the Trinity, that contribute to recharge in the contributing zone, oftentimes as much or as more possibly than the recharge in the recharge zone. So that, I think, is one of the areas that really remains to be better appreciated as we go forward. But I think, Everton, I gave you some of the, you know, the basics of the aquifer, but I'll let Jack step in. He's well tuned to.
Well, kind of historically, that there was karstification that occurred in the Cretaceous, and then it was buried, and then during the Miocene, with the faulting that shows in our book, these things were brought up, and there's been intense karstification since then. And there's some things we're still learning. We talked about the bad water zone, and it looks like there are bacterial activities where the bad water zone meets the freshwater zone that is causing intensive karstification right at that boundary, which is something we didn't know about 10, 15 years ago. And so this karstification is still going. And as Ron said, it's really a triple permeability, triple porosity system. You've got the matrix, which is permeable, low, you have fractures, and then you have these conduits. So you've got 3 different flow systems you've got to deal with, which makes the modeling incredibly difficult.
Yes, very difficult. Karst is always a challenge, right?
And as Ron said, you know, some of the first studies, they put a gauge at the upstream and bottom ends of the recharge zone and calculated loss and said that was the recharge. And these people weren't dumb. This is all the data they had. But as you started putting more data, we found it's more complex. And the places in the recharge zone sometimes are not recharging. And it turns out, as we look at these things, these karst systems are just incredibly complex. They're beautiful in a way because we can keep studying them for years.
Exactly. Well, that's fun. I like it. Yes, yeah. But you know, but it needs work, and you know, and I hope your book will help with that because it's well put and well organized. So there's a question that arises from that, because when, well, we have experienced that aquifers are really not well regulated in the world. Right? People talk about water everywhere, but not really about groundwater and regulations in groundwater. How is the water regulated in the Edwards Aquifer if it's, because it's well studied?
But
And
it's,
is it well regulated? What do you think? And it's more is well monitored? And if not, what would you suggest to improve it?
well, I think we're in Texas, we are lucky because I think our monitoring system with the Texas Water Development Board is really very, very good. But the regulation system is evolving continually. Now, the original Texas law followed the old English law that you were allowed to pump as much water as you wanted out of your land. And if it affected somebody else, that was too bad. And that was based on the English law where they had plenty of water and small pumps. Later, they said, well, you can't cause subsidence. And you can't pump water out to maliciously hurt your neighbor. You just can't pump it out to be mean. But if you're using it beneficially, you can use all you want. And that was the law. But it turned out that's was not satisfactory. And so we established what we call groundwater conservation districts. And there's, well, what is it? We have 92 of them in the state.
Yeah, yeah.
Thereabouts, and so we have two very important ones for the Edwards Aquifer. We have the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and then we have the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. And these people have the authority to regulate pumping. They have the authority as spring flows drop, and typically measured by a monitoring well, they can start shutting off users one by another. And in this, they're also working with the various water utility systems to get alternate ways to bring in different water when the spring flows are low. And so I think the regulation is pretty good, but there are still legal problems because in Texas, the courts have said you actually own the water under your land. And if you can't pump it out, you're entitled to compensation. It's going through the courts, but we don't know how this is going to be. So I think this water law is going to be evolving. Well, it is evolving and will continue to evolve. But I think, Ron, I think the regulation for the Edwards Aquifer is pretty good.
It is for the groundwater.
Yeah.
There's another complication, and that's, Jack said, the groundwater is owned by the landowner. Surface water is owned by the state. Which is, you can understand the problem, when you have a hyperrate system, water goes underground, it's owned by the owner, comes to the surface, owned by the state, and back and forth. One of the other issues on regulation, and Jack's correct, the groundwater is probably fairly well regulated for the Edwards, but what isn't well regulated is land use over the aquifer, which would impact the quality of recharge. That's under a different state entity. It's under the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality. And they are not empowered sufficiently, in my estimation, in order to regulate what happens over the recharge zone and the contributing zone. So their regulations for the recharge zone of the Edwards is pretty good, but the regulations for the contributing zone, where much of the recharge comes from, are not. And that's something TCQ and the state needs to come to grips and appreciate what's been learned over the last couple of decades. And beef up those protections for the recharge over the contributing zone.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. While you were talking, I was thinking, because here in Brazil and in many other places, like here in Brazil, the water belongs to the state, then groundwater just as surface water. And you're allowed to pump water as long as you have a permit, right?
Yep.
And for this amount of water. So that is a bit different from what you mentioned, but you mentioned something that would be interesting here maybe. Here we have the organization of watersheds for water in general. And that, that didn't, when they created that, groundwater was not thought of completely. Well, as you know, that happens everywhere. But you know, you have groundwater districts. That's kind of interesting for being mimicked here and there, you know, because then you have a specific concern on groundwater. That's interesting. I think you should consider writing something about that. That would be very welcome, really. No kidding. That'll be because it's an example. How can you match that with surface water when we're talking about regulations? You know, that's something.
Well,
like
and
that.
Everton, I think we had the same thing here in Texas because we had, you know, the Guadalupe River Basin and the Colorado River Authority. Initially, we looked at the water resources by river watersheds, but
Yeah.
these karstic systems, they don't correspond necessarily
Yeah,
to these
exactly.
river watersheds, you know.
Yeah.
And so, and there's some places in Texas where there is no surface water and it's only groundwater. And so I think when they established these groundwater conservation districts, each one is almost unique. And I think some have very little power, others have lots of power. Some have taxied authority, but it's and we have developed what is called, each area is supposed to come up with their desired future conditions. What do they want the groundwater situation to be like in 50 years? And from this, we are managing it.
Quite interesting. And how how are they physically divided into because this is
most of them are unfortunately are divided by political districts, by counties or districts. But some, like the Edwards Aquifer Authority, is defined by the aquifer.
Oh, that's very good. That's very good. And then the how do you do the political arrangements after that? That's the tricky part, I guess.
Yeah.
Very
We'll provide the data, and we hope the politicians are able to make sense of it, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's a great hope there. Okay.
And one of the things Texas is doing, there's an intensive look at brackish water, because we have lots of water that's, you know, between 1,000 and 10,000 milligrams per liter. And with the improvements in desalination, some of these brackish water zones essentially will become aquifers. You'll just be treating the water, not just by putting chlorine or ozone in, but by taking some of the salt out. And so I think that's going to, how that's going to affect the future of the aquifer, we don't know. But it's going to be an additional source, I think, of water.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes. Okay. So, what about the sustainability of the aquifer? How it's used, and are the future generations in safe situation to explore the beauties of the springs we see today?
We hope so. We hope that the springs will continue to flow because they're important recreational assets for each of these areas. Well, like I said, I feel, and Ron, I think on a kind of a long-term basis, I think the aquifer is sustainable, but there's going to be periods where it's not going to be. So sustainability is kind of on a time frame. If you're talking about a year or two, there may be years when it's not sustainable. You can't do it. But I think over the long run, because it's capable of taking so much recharge, and we get very heavy rainfalls here. We get, you know, you've been known to get a meter of rain in 24 hours.
Yeah.
In these areas.
Really?
So the recharge can come, and the aquifer can basically fill up relatively rapidly.
Yeah, that's lucky. That's very good.
You know, the population has shown some great insight, and this is by the utilities driving this. But you know, the San Antonio area, for example, has, I think, doubled its population over the past several decades, but is still using the same amount of water. And they've done that by educating the people in terms of, you know, watering lawns, which is one of the biggest usages of the water around here. So they need to continue that, because when they go into a prolonged drought, they're not going to be able to have, you know, the St. Augustine grasses from up north survive during that period unless they are pumping an awful lot of water. So I think a lot of the sustainability of the future is going to depend upon, the population continuing to go in that direction, that they don't have a lot of water to waste on different things, and they're going to have to tighten their water belt a couple notches during those periods. But they have Jack's described it. They have a method in place in order to address that as things go into the future, and we see how it happens. But until we go through a prolonged drought, we won't know exactly what happens.
The agricultural uses of water, of course, is very consumptive, and they've got a voluntary irrigation suspension program where they will actually pay farmers to stop irrigating. And so therefore the water can go to San Antonio and the municipalities. And that's, I think, has turned out to be relatively successful.
Yeah, that is interesting. That is interesting. Yeah, but it's well, if that works for cast aquifers, would that work for other aquifers as well? Because the response is not going to be so quick, right? That's interesting.
The other aquifer, which everybody has heard about, probably is the High Plains or the Ogallala aquifer, which is not. And there, I don't think they're paying farmers to stop pumping. In fact, I think it's just an economic thing. When your water gets too low, you switch to dryland farming.
Okay.
Ron, as I recall, that's the situation in the High Plains. And that's been a very prolific aquifer, but that does not recharge. It recharges very slowly. Yeah. And in some of the places, they're continuing to pump, growing crops like mad. Grapes is the new one. But where the aquifer is more marginal, where it's thinner, it has basically become dewatered. And there the farmers just have to switch to a different type of farming. So they're not paying farmers there to suspend irrigation.
Yeah, that's what I imagine. Yeah, it'll be similar here. Yeah, good, guys. Well, our time is up here.
Everton, what university are you with?
Now I'm with none. I'm retired from university. I was at University of São Paulo here.
Oh, very good. Okay, yeah. Okay.
University of São Paulo, but I quit. Actually, I have a consulting company here in Brazil.
Oh, very good.
Well, I was working. Now I'm working a lot with groundwater project. Really, that's a time-consuming endeavor, and at least I can enjoy it, and I can meet people like you, which is always welcome. That's very nice. That's very nice. But that's what I'm doing. Are you still connected to the university? Are you still teaching?
I am emeritus, so I'm no longer teaching. I get into the office 3 or 4 hours most days, and my latest project is I'm looking at measuring secondary time-dependent consolidation in sediments of the Gulf Coast. So this is which has been kind of overlooked. So this is my latest one now, and I do some consulting on the side, and of course the Edwards always calls, and Ron is also working out in one of my favorite areas out in West Texas, where there's some huge springs out there, including ones that went dry famously because of irrigation pumping. So,
really?
So we'll continue to look at the springs in West Texas and the Edwards for sure.
Good.
And but Ron is retired. He still works.
Good.
Well, both you guys started out talking about your love for hydrology. It gets in your blood, and
yes,
you don't walk away from it easily. It's so it's so important to humanity and society that it's easy to wake up in the day and spend your time on it, and and try to make whatever small contribution you can to the resource. So.
And water is our most important natural resource.
Yeah,
I agree. Actually, it's not about the aquifer here we're talking, but today we have sort of trying to create a money related to carbon sequestration, anything
Yeah.
related to carbon now. And I said, why not water? Water
Yeah.
is so important, right? And now people are pricing water based on carbon. Doesn't make sense to us.
Yeah.
What is that? So we have a long way to go, guys. Thank you very much. That was very nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Everton. Yeah.
Your book, I hope it's going to be a success because it's a beautiful book. It's a nice reading, and it's very, not only illustrative, but we learn a lot on how to put things together in a nice way. Congratulations for a job
Thank you.
well done.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm
Thank you
glad you
very much.
enjoyed it.
Thank you,
Okay.
guys.
Bye-bye.